If I challenged you to draw a bowl of fruit, a tree, or your dog, you could probably give me a pretty decent sketch. That's because these are physical things, but what if I asked you to draw the feeling you get when you listen to your favorite song or the taste of your favorite food? Those things are abstract and they're harder to pin down visually. What do they look like? Because this problem of abstraction interests me a lot, I challenged my good friend D3trois, a talented artist, to draw 3 complex mental disorders. Let's see how he did. Hello Neuronauts, Cognic here, and today we are going to dive into the world of abnormal psychology and art to talk about 3 complex neurological disorders. We'll be talking about dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, and synesthesia. I challenged my good friend D3trois, who makes some really wonderful artwork, to try his hand at drawing what he thinks these disorders look like. He makes YouTube videos as well, so if you like art and drawing videos, you should definitely go and check out his channel. Before we see what he made and hear from the creative legend himself, I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about the disorders that I asked him to draw. To start, let's talk about dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This is a disorder you may have heard of before, but you might know it by its previous name, multiple personalities disorder. When people think of DID, they tend to think of the extreme case, where someone has 5 or 6 different identities, each with their own name and character. DID is generally milder than that. To have DID, you really need to have 2 or more distinct personality states. The 2 or more states don't need to have their own names and outfits, but they do need to be 2 or more separate modes of operation. One symptom of DID is memory loss, also called amnesia. This amnesia usually impacts selective information about events or people, or personal information about the person who has the disorder. A sense of detachment, a dissolution from reality, or a blurred sense of self-identity are all symptoms of DID as well. In extreme cases, this can translate into situations like in the movie Split, where a person has different identities that represent each of their distinct personality states. So what causes DID? Well, it's been associated to severe trauma, particularly in childhood. Children who grow up with serious abuse or in an extremely stressful environment might develop DID as a response. A psychological assessment of the symptoms generally states that the brain tries to protect itself by repressing harmful memories with amnesia, while also retreating into multiple personalities when threatened. From a neuroscience perspective, it's widely understood in our field that abuse and trauma in childhood can have significant impacts on brain development. In DID, neuroscientists have suggested that developmental issues in the orbital frontal cortex may be to blame. The orbital frontal cortex is the surface of your brain that sits right above the eye sockets. In neuroscience, orbits are our fancy way of saying the eyes. The orbitofrontal cortex has a lot of connections to memory and emotion processing areas of the brain. A traumatized child might have developmental differences in their orbital frontal cortex, which could lead to issues with memory and emotional regulation and processing. So now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to D3trois, who's created an image of what he thinks DID looks like.
Well, hello there, Neuronauts. I'm D3trois. First of all, thanks Cognic for challenging me to draw. As you said, a bowl of fruit or a tree is easy enough to draw, but mental disorders is definitely a first for me, so it is an honor to be a part of this video. In order to represent the idea in a drawing, I had to break it down into the most simple way I can imagine it. There is one physical body, but multiple persons inside, all of them different and with their own feelings, expressions and needs. The best way to represent a person is with the face, right? Eyes are the window to the soul, as they say. But with DID, alters take over the communal body, blurring the line between one identity and the next. This is what I wanted to represent, the morphing between 2 identities. But why stop at 2? In this formless representation of the idea, every mouth transforms into another face's eyes and vice versa. All of these faces, all of the different individuals have to share the same body, each trying to express themselves. The result was this very Picasso-esque mass of faces that my fountain pen laid on the sketchbook. After scanning the drawing and putting it into Photoshop, I added some colors to give a sense of 3-dimensionality and make it more striking. All in all, this is just my personal representation of the idea, which turned out to be relatively easy to produce. I thought this was supposed to be a challenge, but maybe you have another mental disorder that you would like for me to draw for you, Cognic?
Next, we're going to talk about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a disorder characterized by a range of odd symptoms, including hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. Hallucinations in schizophrenia are generally auditory, meaning a person will hear things that aren't actually there. Hallucinations can also be visual, where they see things that aren't there. Delusions in schizophrenia occur when false beliefs are held. Generally, these beliefs take some common forms. Many patients with schizophrenia incorrectly believe that they are extremely famous or highly skilled. They might talk about themselves as an extremely important person with a higher goal or duty in life that has been entrusted to them particularly. There are also delusions that take a negative form. For example, a person with schizophrenia might think that everybody hates them or is secretly talking about them. They might also have what are called paranoid delusions, where they think that an individual or a group is actively hunting them for some purpose, either to capture them, kill them, or torture them. Disorganized thinking, another symptom of schizophrenia, is noticeable through disorganized speech. A person with schizophrenia, when asked a question, might return an unintelligible or unrelated answer. These symptoms, along with a few others, can lead to what psychiatrists and psychologists call negative symptoms. Negative symptoms are a collection of behaviors that stop an individual from being able to function normally. Negative symptoms can cause things like reduced physical hygiene or a lack of social or emotional awareness. So now you may be wondering, what in the brain causes schizophrenia? We don't really know for sure because of how complex the disorder is, but there are some very promising theories with evidence to back them up. Schizophrenia is thought to be a genetic disorder, or a disorder that is associated with mutations in a person's DNA. It's thought that 0.5 to 1% of the population experience some degree of schizophrenia, but if you have a first-degree relative with schizophrenia, your risk of being schizophrenic jumps to around 10%. It's believed that mutations in the genes for dysbindin, neuregulin 1, DAOA, COMT, and DISC1 could cause schizophrenia. Specifically, a type of mutation called a copy number variant, or a CNV, could be to blame. This type of mutation deletes or duplicates a large portion of DNA from a gene. So what do all these genes do? Well, they alter the ability of your neurons to migrate. As your brain develops, it grows from the inside out. Each new layer of neurons has to migrate from the center of the brain to the surface, meaning it has to move through all of the layers that grew before it. Usually, this migration works great, but if it doesn't, a layer of neurons could get trapped between other layers of neurons. Neurons getting stuck where they're not supposed to be could lead to cross-wiring, and eventually could lead to what we call schizophrenia. As an important side note, I want to mention that people with schizophrenia are generally non-violent. If you don't know someone with schizophrenia personally, your only exposure to schizophrenia might be through police shows or the news. These aren't the correct representations of what schizophrenia really is. Violence from a schizophrenic patient is rare, and so we shouldn't look at schizophrenia as something to be feared, but rather something that requires treatment and help. Wow, I talked about that for a long time, so I think now we should see what our good friend D3trois thinks schizophrenia looks like. I'll let him take over to talk about his artwork.
Thanks, Cognic. Schizophrenia is a great drawing prompt. Here is what my approach was in order to represent schizophrenia. I drew the mind as a sphere of bubbling thoughts. I wanted to represent the complexity of the mind in an ominous form, as intimidating as the description of the symptoms you just gave. Two aspects of these symptoms struck me, and I knew what I wanted to add in the drawing. In the middle of the incoherence that were the formless thoughts and hallucinations, I wanted to add the semblance of coherence, the crescent shapes here to remind us that this is a sphere. The second aspect I had to get in there was the paranoia, and what better way to draw it than a bunch of spikes sticking out of the sphere? The defensive spikes around the person's mind represent the wish to protect themselves from the delusions that somebody or something might be after them. In the end, this is the drawing I came up with on my sketchbook. The colors I added in Photoshop are simply there to add to the ominous feeling I felt while hearing about schizophrenia.
Finally, we'll discuss synesthesia, one of the most unique neurological conditions that I'm aware of. Synesthesia, simply put, is the crossing of the senses. A synesthetic person will experience something normally through one of their senses, but this experience might provoke an unrelated sense to have an experience as well. For example, when you look at a painting, you use your sense of sight. A person with synesthesia might be able to taste or hear the painting just by looking at it. Wait, what? That's right, a synesthetic person can experience senses in random combinations. They might see colors when they taste food or hear sounds when they look at a sunset. Some people experience synesthesia as hearing things or seeing colors when they look at numbers or letters. This is called color grapheme synesthesia or audio grapheme synesthesia depending on the sense that's triggered. A grapheme is just a number or letter symbol that represents a sound, for example, 3 or A. Synesthesia is also thought to be genetic and it's very heritable. If your father has synesthesia, you have an 18% chance of having it if you're male and a 62% chance if you're female. If your mother has synesthesia, your chances of having it are 40% if you're male and 66% if you're female. I don't know if you noticed, but the chances of having synesthesia if you're female increase dramatically compared to if you're male. Synesthesia is more common in females. In the brain, synesthesia is thought to be caused by a lack of neural pruning during development. During development, some parts of our brain become naturally disconnected as we grow. This is neural pruning. Like pruning a bush or a tree, neural pruning decides which connections between neurons to keep or cut as we develop. In particular, people who see colors when they see certain numbers or letters have been shown to have connections between the grapheme processing parts of their brain and the V4 color area of the visual cortex. This part of the visual cortex is activated by color images far more than grayscale ones, which is why it gets the name color area. So connections between the grapheme processing parts of the brain and the V4 color area of the visual cortex can cause an individual to see colors when they see a number or letter symbol. Now isn't that pretty neat? In extremely rare cases, if a patient gets damage to a part of their brain called the hypothalamus from a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, they can actually get synesthesia. I was fortunate enough to meet an anonymous man named Patient George in one of my neuroscience classes. This man had a stroke which damaged his hypothalamus, and he actually acquired synesthesia. That makes his case one of 2 that have ever been reported. So finally, as my greatest challenge, I'll hand it over to D3trois one last time to show us what synesthesia means to him visually.
How do you represent multiple senses mingling together when you can only draw on a 2-dimensional piece of paper? You're asking me to draw touch and hearing and smell and mix them together in such a way that only sight would suffice to understand? Now, that's a real challenge. This one stumped me for a while. Synesthesia is the reason I drew first with ink and then moved on to digital coloring. With a fountain pen, I drew a grid, but not quite. Instead of following their respective path, the lines twist and change directions. This is a representation of how synesthesia changes the way your senses interact, rather than having them in separate orientations. And then what? What else do I do? I added colors and tweaked the lighting of the piece, adding brightness here and there, darkening other parts. The result is quite warm compared to the other 2 disorders, but at this point it doesn't make any sense anymore, even for me. This is my final drawing, synesthesia. That's it, Cognic. You win. I have to say, this was a very difficult challenge you gave me, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me. Bye, fellow neuronauts.
I want to give a huge thank you to D3trois for all of his hard work on the art and the recording. I really suggest that you go check out his channel. This is my first ever collaboration on YouTube, and it's been a really fun time. D3trois made a video focused more on the art creation itself, and maybe while you're checking it out, you can show him some support and subscribe to his channel as well. I'll leave links to his video and his channel in the description below, and on the end screen. D3trois does fountain pen ink drawings, digital art, and sometimes even adds a little computer programming into the mix. We have around the same amount of subscribers right now, but I think he's going to take the permanent lead very soon. That's it for this video, but if you liked what you saw, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you can see future videos that I make. Take care of your brains, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace, guys.